All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Mia Armstrong-López. I'm a managing editor at ASU Media Enterprise and one of the editors behind the Future Tense Fiction series, which you can read in Issues in Science and Technology. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Gregory Mone. Greg is the author or co-author of 21 books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers that have been translated into 25 languages. A former columnist at Popular Science, he has covered robotics, AI, cosmology, and futuristic tech for more than 2 decades. And Greg is also the author of The Funniest Centaur Alive, which is January's Future Tense Fiction story. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and so just to start, I would love for you to describe, if you only had 1 or 2 sentences to describe what The Funniest Centaur is about for our audience, how would you put it?
So thematically, it's about kind of AI being out in the world, who gets to use it, who's using it to get ahead, and sort of some of the unexpected consequences of the proliferation of this technology. From a story standpoint, it's about a woman at a tech conference who's trying to get ahead and stay ahead as her company's cutting jobs and sort of her internal debate about whether to use this incredible technology she accidentally comes across to basically finish out a presentation that she didn't know she was going to have to do. So it's kind of
Yeah,
a survival story in a little bit of in a way, I would say.
yeah, it's a survival story in a AI world, and it's also a survival story in like a modern workplace world, right? Like sort of the cutthroat workplace world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think often in these kinds of stories, I mean, I love reading science fiction. I love thinking about it. I write a lot of nonfiction as well. Um, but I think often in these kind of stories, when we get creative, we tend to go to these sort of wild and far off worlds, or even just worlds within our own current world. Like, maybe it's a advanced lab or something like that. And I thought it would be fun to set this in a kind of a mundane, everyday business environment, where it's actually at a technology conference, and just see how that might play out in that sort of a world. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it is in some ways it's interesting because in some ways it's a mundane world because it's sort of a tech conference, but in other ways it's a very unmundane world because it's in Las Vegas, right? And so
Right.
the story sort of starts in this stand-up comedy club, and we have our protagonist and her coworker who are sort of trying to maybe blow off steam in this stand-up comedy club before one of them has to give a big presentation the next day. They run into a comic who is using AI in a perhaps creative way. But I'm wondering, I was really drawn when you first pitched the story to that setting of like Vegas technology conference and then also slash stand-up comedy club. Is there anything that drew you in particular to like comedy as a arena or Vegas as a setting, to sort of explore some of these topics?
Yeah, so by saying mundane, I didn't mean I just meant compared to a spaceship, right? But maybe Vegas can be a little bit like a spaceship. So no, it is an exciting and interesting world. I think what drew me to this idea and and sort of setting it with a stand-up and starting in this stand-up comedy club is, you know, on the one hand, there was a period where I was working on these 2 nonfiction books. One of them's about robotics, one of them's about AI with Daniela Rus, who's the director of the AI lab at MIT. And so I was very deep into the kind of the technology and the science and the how it works. And at the same time, I write books for kids. And part of that is you go out and you talk to schools and you kind of tell stories to kids, and you're out there in these big assemblies trying to keep these kids interested. And I've done it long enough over the years where I've kind of like honed my act and refined it, and I know what's going to work and where to pause and what's going to make kids laugh. And it feels a little bit like stand up, even though I'm not that funny, because it's some of the same principles. When you listen and read and learn about stand up comedy and the way it all works. So I've got that on the one hand, and then I'm learning about reinforcement learning in AI and reinforcement learning with human feedback. And I started thinking there was this really tight link between kind of what a stand-up does when they go out on the road and they practice their craft and try and get better, based on the feedback from the audience, right? If someone laughs, they're doing well. If the audience has no reaction, they're not. So that's kind of a little bit of reinforcement learning with human feedback. And I thought, I just had this idea of what if someone could sort of encapsulate that in a program and start to run with it, where you can kind of accelerate the process. So where a normal stand-up might spend years on the road perfecting their act, what if they did it in simulation? Could they do it faster and faster and faster and sort of be good in a month? That's where the story starts, but all of that kind of happens before the story, right? So you kind of get brought into that and filled in later on. But that's kind of the moment the story begins, is where we have this comic who's suddenly and inexplicably hilarious when he was really terrible just a couple months ago. And and that's what sort of piques the, our other character's curiosity, like, what did this guy do? How did he cheat? And is it cheating, right? Is it cheating to use AI for something like that? So that's kind of where it started.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting, and that's sort of one of the I wanted to talk a little bit about that debate, right? So in this fictional world that we've imagined, you have sort of two sets of people. You have centaurs, and then you have non-centaurs. So first of all, like just to start there, how are those define those two different groups for me and how they work in the story?
Well, this centaur concept has been around for a little while. It's a super cool idea where it's basically, you're kind of like, when you're working with these technologies, you're like this empowered person. You just have sort of you've got your own talents, and then you're complemented by AI or whatever the advanced technology is to just be a little bit better at what you're doing. Now, as we've seen this technology proliferate and start to get out into the world, there are people who are really bitter about it and don't like it, people who are embracing it and loving it. In my own sort of playing around with it, I've found, there are some really cool, fun parts, and then there are parts that have actually made me sort of retract into my own head and realize that, the stuff that's going on in our own brains is so amazing and powerful. And so there's a part of me that wants to completely pull back and not use anything and just like focus on the human mind and what my own mind can do based on my experiences. And then there's a part of you that wants to sort of, borrow tips and tricks and tools from these from these AI technologies that are out there. So I could see a world where, there's a little bit of a split, and some people go one direction, some people go the other. And, from the perspective of a business employing people, which is where this story sort of looks, if you've got people at a trade show that are standing at a booth trying to interest customers to come up and talk to them, well, you might have people who are walking by that they don't want to be tracked. They don't want to be, they don't want to be filmed through smart glasses, or have me say I had augmented glasses that's sort of tracking your reaction as we're talking and telling me, oh, she's interested, she's not, she's looking away. Maybe you don't want that, right? So maybe you want to work with someone who's like the purist who has nothing, right? And so that's kind of how it sets up, is you've got these two people. One's a purist, and she refuses to use any of these like really advanced technologies. I mean, you're allowed to use a phone and things like that. And then the other one is kind of using everything, where he's got a little drone that sits on his shoulder that flies off around the conference and checks stuff out and reports back to him through his glasses and other things like that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And so we have sort of the centaurs who are maybe more tech maximalists, who are like, I'll use anything I can to try and make me more quote unquote effective in my work or in my life. Then we have the purist folks that you're describing, and sort of one of the central debates. You're supposed to identify yourself sort of outwardly, which one you are, right? So people have that context, have that information about you. And sort of one of the debates within the story is that this stand-up comic is using tech in this way that you're describing, right? Sort of like an AI enabled headset that is allowing him to run all of these different versions of his act and assess the audience and figure out what's going to work best. And he's sort of not disclosing himself as a centaur. So there's sort of that debate, right, that you mentioned before, over is this cheating, is this not cheating? So I'm really interested in sort of what you were thinking about in terms of, because it reminded me a lot about the ways that there's all sorts of technical or sort of ethical debates of how should we disclose when we're using AI, right? And in what way? And so I'm wondering like how you were thinking about that as you were writing the story. In the story, there's this very physical identifier of disclosing AI, but what sort of things going on in the real world in terms of transparency and AI were you thinking about as you were writing the story?
So I think I don't have, and I think one of the great things of fiction is that you can kind of, when you can't make up your mind on a specific question, you can kind of split your opinions and put them in different characters and have them go at each other. So I think I did a little bit of that here. And I think, because I'm very torn. I mean, I wrote a piece for the communications of the ACM on data poisoning. And, it was all about, I was so sort of entranced and by these by the stable diffusion generative AI tools and how fun and fantastic they are for someone like me who's not a visual artist to be able to just type in a prompt and generate something interesting and cool. And then you find out then you learn of these poor artists whose work has just been decimated, their workload because, especially like this group of concept artists and illustrators, because someone can now go in and just type a prompt and sort of get that concept art without paying them for their work. And then also obviously the idea that their work was sort of used and used to train these models without their consent necessarily. So it's a really thorny, difficult issue. I What was your original question again? Because now I'm just rambling, which I tend to do. But
No, well, I mean, that was sort of my question was sort of a rambled question, which was like transparency in AI. Like, how do we do disclosures? Does the story have something to say about that?
yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think transparency is really important. So I think it's absolutely very, very important. And so, there are central characters in the story who aren't transparent, and I hope it comes across that that's not a good thing. So this idea that you would use AI to really get better at something, but then claim that you don't use AI, you know, just because you're not actively using it, it's not something in your glasses. But if you've used it to train extensively and get way better at something really quickly, and then pretend that you didn't, yeah, that's wrong, right? So that's kind of one of the embedded ideas in the piece. But I do think that, yeah, I think transparency is essential, openness, and all of this.
Yeah, and I'm curious because I was thinking as I was preparing for this interview also about the fact that in your career you've done a lot of, as you're saying, a lot of speeches, a lot of talks about books, about the issues that you've covered, and you've gone through this sort of organic, natural process of iterating your quote unquote act and figuring out what works, what doesn't, when to pause, what will land with folks. Um, I'm wondering, like, if you were to have access to a tool like the one in the story, right, where you could sort of do that in an accelerated way with the help of AI, would you use that tool, or would you sort of lean into this other part of your brain that you were mentioning, where you're just sort of fascinated by the inner workings of your brain unassisted by some of these tools?
It'd be really hard not to use it if something like this existed, right? I mean, or at least just in the same way that, I was working on a book proposal at one point. Oh, actually, it was for this book, The Mind's Mirror, about AI. You know, ChatGPT had just busted out, and Daniela, my colleague, and I said we have to just try it and see what you can't resist not trying to play with it. And so we tested it out, and in the very early days, and tried to write a draft book proposal. And it wasn't at all what we wanted, obviously, but it was fascinating to see. So I think it would be really hard not to play with something like this and try it out. I do think, getting back to this idea of like looking at your own mind and figuring out how it works, one of the really interesting things for me in experimenting and playing with these tools, especially the large language models, is that it made me realize that there were certain flaws in my own writing process, that where maybe it's not just that I was working too quickly, but I was almost generating content like an LLM, just sort of cranking stuff out. And there were, I would find cliches occasionally in my writing, which is just like, it's a dagger to the heart. It's horrible, And I think, when you do that and when you drop in a cliche unwittingly because you're just moving through a sentence and trying to produce your piece, you know, it's almost like it is kind of the way a language model works, right? It's just pattern recognition where you wrote something and then your brain gives you the next likely phrase. And so you put down a cliched phrase. And so playing with these things, thinking about how they work, thinking about how our own minds work has forced me to refine my process. And and like I said, retract a little bit where, I mean, I'm not even using Microsoft Word anymore for my first drafts. I'm like using Notepad because there's less there. There's nothing. Although Microsoft just released a little icon with the magic ChatGPT edition there, but it doesn't bother you. It doesn't jump out and say hello, so that's good. And that's been interesting for me. Playing with these things has really given me insight into my own creative process and writing process and the way the brain works.
I love that. And I think it really connects back to, right, like this question and debates that the story pokes at about AI and creativity and where it sort of expands human possibility and where it might restrict it. And it's just the story is a fascinating thought experiment. So I would encourage everyone to go read it. It's on issues.org. And Greg, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about the Funniest Centaur Alive.
Thank you so much for the great questions. I really enjoyed it.